My name is Angela Sterling, and I am 32 years old. 14 days ago, my parents stood in my living room and sold my house to a cash buyer. They forged my signature on the deed. They drank my vintage wine. They looked a licensed notary in the eye and swore I had succumbed to my injuries and left no other heirs. They did all of this while I lay trapped in a medically induced coma just 3 miles away, fighting for every single breath. They thought they had erased me to fund my brother Brad and his failing tech startup. They thought the quiet daughter they always overlooked was finally out of the way. Before I explain how I walked out of that hospital and dismantled their lives, welcome to Sophia Told Stories. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this kind of justice truly resonates with you. Drop your age, your location, and your local time in the comments. I want to know exactly who is listening and where you are right now. Now let me take you back to the sterile white walls of the intensive care unit and the moment I realized my own flesh and blood had left me for dead. The rhythmic, hollow beeping of the heart monitor was the only proof my heart was still beating. I woke up with my body encased in plaster and my throat raw from the ventilator tube the doctors had just removed. My vision swam in a haze of clinical fluorescent light and heavy narcotics. I am a venture capitalist. I spend my days analyzing risk, restructuring corporate debt, and navigating hostile boardrooms. I built a covert empire, choosing to live in modest sweaters and drive an unremarkable sedan precisely to keep my wealth hidden from Richard and Susan, my parasitic parents. I expected to see them sitting in the plastic chairs by my bed. I expected forced tears, or maybe a hushed conversation about whether I had updated my will before the car crash. Instead, the room was empty. The silence was heavier than the cast on my leg. A few minutes later, an attending nurse walked in, holding a digital tablet. She did not offer a warm smile. She looked at me with a suffocating pity that made my heart monitor spike. I tried to speak, managing only a raspy whisper to ask where my family was. The nurse hesitated, her eyes dropping to the linoleum floor before she delivered the news. She informed me that my top-tier private health insurance had been abruptly canceled that morning. I stared at her. The painkillers failed to numb the sudden ice in my veins. My next of kin had contacted the billing department and revoked all financial authorization. The nurse explained, her voice tight with discomfort, that I was scheduled for an immediate transfer to an underfunded state ward by the end of the day. I asked when my parents had last visited. The nurse shifted her weight, explaining that Richard and Susan had not set foot in the hospital since the night of the crash. Instead, they had faxed over a power of attorney. They had spoken to the hospital administration, declared me neurologically unresponsive, and stated I was untreatable. They legally isolated me, stripping me of my autonomy so they could bypass the probate courts and raid my estate. They wanted me discarded in a forgotten ward, unable to speak, unable to fight back. They assumed I was just the obedient, unremarkable daughter who would fade away quietly. But they made one fatal miscalculation. My body was broken, but my mind was sharp, and the house they had just fraudulently sold was wired with a hidden security network they knew nothing about. The heavy steel door of the intensive care unit clicked shut, leaving me alone with the rhythmic hum of the machinery keeping me alive. The nurse had taken my chart and walked away, believing I was just another tragic charity case waiting to be shipped off to a neglected state facility. The moment her rubber-soled shoes faded down the corridor, I opened my eyes. The narcotics were a thick fog in my brain, but clarity pierced through the chemical haze. I needed to move. Every millimeter of motion sent a sharp electric jolt of agony radiating from my fractured ribs down to the titanium pins holding my right leg together. I gritted my teeth, swallowing the groan that threatened to escape my dry throat. My right arm was free of IV lines. I slid my hand inch by excruciating inch under the thin, sterile hospital mattress. When the paramedics pulled me from the crushed steel of my sedan 3 days ago, they had unceremoniously dumped my personal effects into a yellow plastic belongings bag. Before the trauma surgeons induced my coma, I had bribed an overworked orderly with a diamond tennis bracelet from my wrist to retrieve one specific item from that bag. My fingers brushed against cold brushed metal. I gripped it tight and pulled it out. It was my secondary encrypted corporate smartphone. It possessed no social media apps and no connection to my public identity. It was the device I used to authorize 9-figure venture capital acquisitions and monitor my private assets. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen glowed to life, illuminating my bruised face in the dim hospital room. I bypassed the standard menus and opened a proprietary security application linking directly to my primary residence. Richard and Susan always believed I lived in a modest 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of San Jose. I let them believe I was a mid-level analyst, scraping by on a basic salary. In reality, I owned a custom-built architectural masterpiece in the hills of Silicon Valley. It featured bullet-resistant glass, biometric locks, and a closed-circuit surveillance system engineered by a cybersecurity firm I had personally funded. The property was a fortress disguised as a modern sanctuary. I tapped the screen, bringing up the high-definition infrared camera feeds from the main living area. The video buffered for a fraction of a second before the crisp, full-color image loaded. The audio feed kicked in, bringing the sounds of my own home into the sterile hospital room. There was no grieving going on in my house. There were no tears and no somber reflections on my supposed tragic fate. My father, Richard, was sitting on my imported Italian leather sofa. He had his feet propped up on the polished mahogany coffee table, wearing a tailored suit that looked fresh off the rack. In his right hand, he held a crystal glass, swirling a vintage Pinot Noir from my private cellar. My mother, Susan, sat beside him. She was casually flipping through a stack of documents, wearing a cashmere wrap that she had explicitly pulled from my master bedroom closet. They looked relaxed. They looked victorious. Sitting across from them in one of my velvet accent chairs was a man I did not recognize. He wore a cheap gray suit and carried a battered leather briefcase. On the table between them lay a thick stack of legal paperwork and an official brass embosser. I turned the volume up on the phone, pressing the speaker close to my ear. The man in the gray suit cleared his throat, tapping a pen against the documents. He looked at Richard with a nervous, calculating expression. "So we are clear, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice slick and practiced. "The cash buyer has the funds held in escrow. The title company is ready to process the transfer by the end of the business day. But I need verbal confirmation for the record. The current owner of the property, Angela Sterling, is no longer with us." Richard did not even flinch. He took a slow, appreciative sip of my wine. "That is correct," he replied smoothly. "My daughter succumbed to her injuries late last night. It was very sudden. She was unmarried and left no other heirs. As her next of kin, my wife and I are assuming control of the estate to settle her affairs." Susan nodded, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue in a pathetic display of theatrical sorrow. "It is what Angela would have wanted," she added, her tone dripping with false sincerity. "She always wanted her family to be taken care of." I lay in my hospital bed, staring at the glowing screen. They were selling my house. They had found a crooked notary willing to bypass probate and look the other way while they forged a deed of sale. The notary slid a specific document across the table. "This is the primary transfer authorization," he instructed, tapping the signature line. "I need you to sign here, indicating you have the legal authority to liquidate the asset. Once the ink dries, the buyer will wire the funds directly to the routing number you provided." Richard leaned forward, picking up the pen. He did not hesitate. He forged my signature with a practiced flick of his wrist. It was a terrifyingly accurate replica. He had been perfecting the art of signing my name since I was a teenager, opening credit cards in my identity to fund his gambling habits, before I finally froze my credit and cut him off. Susan leaned over his shoulder, watching the ink dry on the page. $2.5 million, she whispered, her voice trembling with sheer greed. The buyer is actually wiring the full $2.5 million today. Richard stamped the document, handing it back to the notary. He leaned back against the sofa, exhaling a long breath of satisfaction. "We are finally out of the hole, Susan." He turned to look at her, a greedy smile stretching across his face. "As soon as that wire hits our account, we transfer $1 million straight to Brad." Hearing my brother's name sent a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline through my veins. Brad was the golden child. He was the son who could do no wrong, the supposed genius of the family. While I spent my 20s grinding through 80-hour work weeks to build my venture capital firm, Brad was bouncing from one failed startup to another. He sold investors on empty promises and burned through seed money on luxury vacations and imported cars. His latest venture was a vaporware tech company that was currently drowning in debt. He needed a substantial capital injection to avoid bankruptcy and keep up his facade of being a Silicon Valley prodigy. My parents had always prioritized his comfort over my survival. Now they were literally trading my life to fund his delusions. "I will call Brad as soon as the notary leaves," Susan said, reaching for her own glass of wine. "He is looking at commercial real estate downtown today. He wants a penthouse office for the new headquarters. This money is going to change his life, Richard. He is finally going to be the CEO he was born to be. And we get to retire to Florida," Richard chuckled, raising his glass in a toast. "We can finally buy that condo on the water. No more scraping by." I watched them clink their glasses together, celebrating my death, in the very house my hard work had paid for. A normal person might have shattered the phone in a fit of rage. A normal daughter might have wept at the profound betrayal of watching her own flesh and blood discard her for a real estate payout. I did not shed a single tear. Tears were a biological waste of energy, and I needed every ounce of my strength for what came next. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. They believed they had outsmarted the system, bypassing the courts and securing a fortune in an afternoon. They thought the buyer was just an eager investor looking for a quick close. They had no idea that I saw every stroke of the pen. They had no idea that the high-definition cameras in the ceiling had just captured a textbook case of federal wire fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. They had just manufactured the exact evidence required to send them both to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. I pressed the record button on my screen, saving the entire interaction to a secure, encrypted cloud server. The video file synced instantly, placing the digital noose securely around their necks. I locked the phone and slid it back under the mattress, letting the cold reality of the situation wash over me. My parents had drawn the battle lines. They had fired the first shot while I was unconscious. But the war was far from over. I needed to assemble my team. I needed the people who understood how to dismantle a life brick by brick without leaving a trace of their involvement until the final devastating blow. I reached over to the bedside table and pressed the red call button. I did not need a nurse to adjust my pillows or bring me ice chips. I needed a clear line to the outside world. The game had officially started, and it was time to introduce Richard and Susan to my kind of justice. The heavy steel door of the intensive care unit clicked shut, leaving me alone with the rhythmic hum of the machinery keeping me alive. The nurse had taken my chart and walked away, believing I was just another tragic charity case waiting to be shipped off to a neglected state facility. The moment her rubber-soled shoes faded down the corridor, I opened my eyes. The narcotics were a thick fog in my brain, but clarity pierced through the chemical haze. I needed to move. Every millimeter of motion sent a sharp electric jolt of agony, radiating from my fractured ribs down to the titanium pins holding my right leg together. I gritted my teeth, swallowing the groan that threatened to escape my dry throat. My right arm was free of IV lines. I slid my hand inch by excruciating inch under the thin, sterile hospital mattress. When the paramedics pulled me from the crushed steel of my sedan 3 days ago, they had unceremoniously dumped my personal effects into a yellow plastic belongings bag. Before the trauma surgeons induced my coma, I had bribed an overworked orderly with a diamond tennis bracelet from my wrist to retrieve one specific item from that bag. My fingers brushed against cold, brushed metal. I gripped it tight and pulled it out. It was my secondary encrypted corporate smartphone. It possessed no social media apps and no connection to my public identity. It was the device I used to authorize 9-figure venture capital acquisitions and monitor my private assets. I kept my finger pressed against the cold glass, bypassing the hospital intercom entirely. I did not need a sympathetic nurse bringing me water. I needed a war council. My lungs burned with every shallow breath, but I managed to dial a secure number saved under a fake vendor alias. It rang exactly twice. When Victoria answered, her voice was a crisp, impatient razor, accustomed to terrifying junior partners and dismantling hostile corporate mergers. I did not waste breath on pleasantries. I gave her my location, my room number, and a 2-word directive indicating a catastrophic breach. I hung up before she could ask questions, knowing she would be out the door before the screen went black. 35 minutes later, the heavy door to my ICU room swung open. The rhythmic click of designer heels against the sterile linoleum announced her arrival long before she stepped into my line of sight. Victoria wore a charcoal gray Prada suit, cut sharp enough to draw blood. She was my lead corporate attorney, a legal shark, who had spent the last 5 years shielding my venture capital acquisitions from public scrutiny. She was the architect of my financial anonymity. Victoria stopped at the foot of my bed. Her icy demeanor cracked for a fraction of a second when she saw the plaster cast encasing my leg and the dark purple bruises blooming across my face. But she did not offer hollow pity or ask how I was feeling. She pulled a leather-bound legal pad from her briefcase, her eyes snapping back to a familiar predatory focus. Right behind her, moving with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating crime scenes, was Detective Liam Gallagher. Gallagher owed me his career. 3 years ago, I had quietly handed his financial crimes unit the encrypted ledgers of a corrupt hedge fund, serving him a career-defining bust on a silver platter. He wore a rumpled trench coat that smelled faintly of stale coffee, a stark contrast to Victoria's immaculate tailoring. I shifted my weight, fighting the searing pain in my ribs, and held out my phone. Victoria took the device, holding it so Gallagher could see the high-resolution screen. I tapped play. The hospital room filled with the clear, undeniable audio of my own living room. Richard and Susan's voices echoed off the sterile walls, bragging about the incoming wire transfer. The 3 of us watched in silence as my father confidently forged my signature on the deed of sale, bypassing probate by swearing to a licensed notary that I had succumbed to my injuries. We watched them toast to my demise with my own vintage wine, already planning how to funnel the stolen millions to my brother Brad. Brad had always been the golden child, the supposed visionary of the family. My parents had bankrupted their own retirement accounts, funding his endless string of failed applications and vaporware startups. I was the invisible daughter, the one expected to quietly pay off their mounting debts, while they paraded Brad around country clubs as a Silicon Valley prodigy. They had drained me emotionally for decades. Now they were literally liquidating my estate, while my heart was still beating. Gallagher exhaled a harsh, ragged breath. His jaw tightened as he watched Susan dab her dry eyes and lie about my final wishes. The seasoned detective reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his radio. His face was a mask of rigid disgust. "I have units 3 blocks from that address," Gallagher stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "They are committing grand larceny, forgery, and identity theft in real time. I can have patrol cars in your driveway before that notary packs up his briefcase. We catch them with the wet ink on the documents, and they are looking at serious time." He raised the radio to his mouth, ready to dispatch the squad. "No." The words scraped out of my dry throat, weak but laced with an unyielding command. Gallagher paused, his thumb hovering over the transmission button. He looked at me, confusion etching deep lines across his forehead. Victoria lowered the phone, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. She understood the cadence of my strategies better than anyone. She remained silent, waiting for my directive. "If you arrest them today," I rasped, struggling to project my voice over the hum of the ventilator machine beside me, "they get a plea deal. They are first-time offenders. They will hire a sleazy defense attorney who will play the grief card. They will stand in front of a sympathetic judge, cry about the trauma of my accident, and claim they were just trying to secure the estate in a moment of panic. They will get probation, maybe a slap on the wrist." Gallagher frowned, slipping the radio back into his pocket. "What do you want, Angela? They just stole a $2.5 million asset." "I want them to feel safe," I replied, a cold clarity settling over my fractured body. "I want the escrow to close. I want the cash to hit their bank account. And then I want them to spend it." Victoria's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. She pulled a silver pen from her pocket and began to write the pieces of the trap already assembling in her mind. "Once they transfer that money to Brad across state lines to fund his new commercial lease," I continued, my breathing shallow but steady, "it ceases to be simple fraud. It becomes federal embezzlement. It triggers interstate wire fraud statutes. I do not want them doing community service, Liam. I want mandatory minimum sentencing. I want them to build their own cages, lock themselves inside, and hand me the key." Gallagher stared at me, a profound respect replacing his initial confusion. He crossed his arms, leaning against the cold hospital wall. "You are talking about letting a multi-million-dollar felony play out to secure a federal indictment. If they lose that money before we freeze the accounts, you might not get it back." "It is bait," I countered, my eyes never leaving his, "and it is my money to risk." Victoria tapped her pen against the legal pad, her mind calculating the logistical nightmare we were about to orchestrate. "To make this work, Angela, your parents cannot know you are conscious. The moment they realize you are recovering, they will attempt to cover their tracks. They might even try to reverse the sale or claim it was a misunderstanding." I nodded the movement, sending a spike of agony up my neck. I knew the rules of engagement. Richard and Susan were cowards at heart. If they suspected I could speak, they would scatter like roaches. To execute this prolonged financial siege, the daughter they betrayed needed to remain a silent, tragic figure. "They told the hospital administration I am neurologically unresponsive," I said, staring up at the fluorescent ceiling lights. "They intend to transfer me to a state-run long-term care facility and forget I exist." Victoria stepped closer to the bed, her expression hardening into pure titanium. "They will try, but they underestimate who they are dealing with. I will not let you rot in a public ward while they sip champagne. I need to vanish. Victoria, if they come looking for me, they need to find a ghost." The attorney closed her legal pad with a sharp, decisive snap. "Consider it done. I will leverage an anonymous donor profile through one of your holding companies. We will bribe the hospital administrators, discharge you under a protected Jane Doe alias, and secure a private rehabilitation suite far away from this city. On paper, Angela Sterling will disappear into the bureaucratic nightmare of the public health system." Gallagher nodded, stepping away from the wall. "I will put a quiet flag on the police database. If your parents file a missing persons report to cover their bases, my unit will intercept it. I will keep a surveillance tail on Richard and Susan. The second they move those stolen funds to your brother, I will have the federal warrants drafted." The pact was sealed. The detective turned and walked out of the ICU, his trench coat disappearing into the sterile hallway, ready to monitor the greatest mistake my family would ever make. Victoria lingered for a moment, her sharp eyes scanning my broken form. She reached out gently, placing my encrypted phone on the bedside table, just within reach of my uninjured arm. "Rest, Angela," she ordered, her tone softening for a fraction of a second before returning to its usual icy professionalism. "I will handle the extraction. When you wake up, you will not be a victim in a hospital bed. You will be a phantom pulling the strings." She turned on her heel and exited the room, the click of her shoes fading into the distance. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness pull me back under. The physical pain was still there, throbbing in my bones, but the despair had vanished. My parents thought they had written the final chapter of my life. They had no idea I was already drafting their eulogy. The morning light pierced the blinds of the intensive care unit, casting long shadows across the sterile linoleum. I lay still, listening to the steady hum of the ventilator. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden door clicked open. It was not a nurse delivering morning medications. The sharp, distinct cadence of luxury heels echoed in the quiet room. I recognized that walk instantly. It was my mother. Susan had arrived. I immediately closed my eyes, letting my facial muscles go slack. I concentrated on my chest, slowing my heart rate to a sluggish, rhythmic crawl. The monitor beside me beeped a steady, monotonous tone, signaling a deep, unresponsive, vegetative state. Susan approached the bed, but she did not reach out to hold my hand. She stopped a full 2 feet away. The overwhelming scent of expensive French perfume flooded the space, masking the sharp odor of hospital antiseptic. Even with my eyes shut, I knew exactly what she was wearing. It was a signature tweed coat, a piece she had coveted for years, but could never afford on my father's meager middle management salary. They had spent decades playing the role of affluent suburbanites, burying themselves in credit card debt to maintain appearances at their local country club. I had quietly paid off those cards more times than I could count, protecting them from bankruptcy, while they paraded my brother Brad around as their ultimate achievement. Now she stood over my broken body, draped in luxury bought directly with the stolen proceeds of my own home. The door opened again. The soft squeak of rubber soles announced the arrival of the attending physician. I kept my breathing shallow, playing the role of the silent tragedy. Mrs. Sterling, the doctor, began, his tone gentle and practiced. "We need to discuss Angela's prognosis. As you know, the insurance provider notified us that her coverage was terminated this morning. Without financial authorization, we must transfer her to a long-term state care facility by the end of the week." Susan let out a theatrical sigh. It was a breathtaking performance. She manufactured a slight tremble in her voice, sounding every bit the devastated mother. "I know, doctor," she whispered, pressing a tissue to her dry cheek. "It breaks my heart, but Richard and I simply do not have the resources to maintain this level of private care. We have to do what is realistic." The physician flipped through his digital chart. "There is another pressing matter. Your daughter sustained severe fractures in her right leg. To ensure she regains full mobility, she requires specialized reconstructive surgery using titanium implants. The state facility will not cover this level of orthopedic intervention. They will simply apply a standard plaster cast. Without the reconstruction, she will likely suffer a permanent debilitating limp. If you can authorize an out-of-pocket payment, we can schedule the surgical team this afternoon." My pulse fluttered, but I forced it down. The reconstructive procedure was a fraction of the millions they had just stolen from me. It was pocket change. Susan did not even hesitate. She shook her head, fixing the doctor with a look of brave resignation. Angela always hated invasive medical procedures. She lied smoothly. She would not want us to go into crippling debt for a surgery that offers no guarantees. We prefer to focus on palliative comfort. Just do the standard cast. She was condemning me to a lifetime of physical disability to save a few $1,000s. She viewed my ability to walk as an unnecessary expense that would cut into her shopping budget. The sheer depravity of her decision settled into my bones, colder than the ice packs numbing my ribs. The doctor offered a grim nod, accepting her authority. He promised to finalize the state ward transfer papers and quietly exited the room. Susan waited until his footsteps faded down the hall. The facade of the grieving mother vanished instantly. She leaned over the metal bed rail. Her face was so close I could feel the heat of her breath against my bruised cheek. The cloying scent of the French perfume was suffocating. "Goodbye, deadweight," she whispered. She turned on her heel and marched out of the room, the door clicking shut behind her. She walked away believing she had just discarded her greatest burden into a bureaucratic nightmare. 10 minutes later, a different set of footsteps entered the room. These were brisk, efficient, and unbothered by the somber atmosphere of the critical care wing. I opened my eyes. Victoria stood at the foot of my bed holding a thick stack of legal folders. She had traded her Prada suit for a sleek black trench coat, looking less like a corporate lawyer and more like a tactical operative. She took the bait, Victoria stated, pulling a pen from her pocket. The hospital administration just filed the transfer request to the state facility. It is time to initiate the extraction. Victoria moved with ruthless precision. She had already wired a substantial anonymous philanthropic grant from one of my offshore holding companies directly to the hospital's research endowment. Attached to that grant was a very strict, airtight, non-disclosure agreement regarding the discharge of one specific patient. The hospital executives were more than happy to bypass standard protocols for a 7-figure donation. Within the hour, a private transport team arrived at the loading dock. They bypassed the main lobby entirely. The paramedics loaded my stretcher into an unmarked luxury medical transport vehicle. On the official public registry, Angela Sterling was documented as transferred to the overcrowded, underfunded state ward. In reality, I was speeding northbound toward the snow-capped mountains under the protected alias of Jane Doe. The journey took 3 hours. We arrived at a secluded, private rehabilitation fortress favored by professional athletes and reclusive executives. It sat behind heavy iron gates surrounded by dense pine forests and guarded by top-tier security personnel. There were no fluorescent lights or linoleum floors here. My suite featured vaulted ceilings, panoramic windows, and a dedicated team of world-class orthopedic surgeons waiting to repair the damage my mother had refused to treat. As the medical staff carefully transferred me into a heated therapeutic bed, Victoria set a sleek new laptop on the mahogany bedside table. She opened the screen connecting it to the secure network. "The surgeons will begin the titanium reconstruction tomorrow morning," Victoria said, adjusting the collar of her coat. "You will walk again, Angela, and you will walk without a limp." I looked at the bright screen of the laptop. The physical pain radiating from my shattered leg was intense, but the anticipation of the coming war dulled the agony. My parents thought I was rotting in a forgotten room, staring at a peeling ceiling. They thought they had successfully erased my existence. I typed a complex sequence of passwords into the terminal, pulling up the hidden financial ledgers tracking the escrow account. The real estate transfer had cleared. The funds were no longer holding in limbo. $2.5 million had just successfully deposited into Richard and Susan's joint checking account. Victoria leaned over my shoulder, watching the green numbers flash across the screen. "The bait is in the water," she observed, her voice a low, dangerous hum. I watched the screen as a secondary alert popped up. It was a wire transfer notification. Richard had wasted 0 time. He had just initiated a significant outbound transaction, moving the bulk of my stolen wealth across state lines directly into a commercial holding account registered to my brother. "Brad just got his seed money," I whispered, a cold, triumphant smile touching the corners of my mouth. "He thinks he is a tech mogul now. Let us see what kind of real estate he buys with my stolen inheritance." The titanium reconstruction of my right leg took 7 hours. I woke up in the private recovery wing of the mountain clinic with my limb encased in state-of-the-art bracing designed to facilitate immediate mobility. The surgical team had performed flawlessly. The searing, blinding pain of the initial crash had been replaced by a dull, productive ache. I refused the heavy narcotic painkillers, opting instead for mild anti-inflammatories. I needed my mind sharp. I needed to watch the digital breadcrumbs my family was eagerly scattering across the financial sector. Sitting up in the heated therapeutic bed, I opened my encrypted laptop. The secure tracking software Victoria had installed painted a vivid picture of my brother's recent activities. The $2 million wire transfer had successfully settled into a newly minted commercial holding account registered under Brad's name. He did not let the funds sit idle. Brad was a creature of instant gratification. He possessed the unique ability to mistake unearned cash for personal genius. My brother was a master of Silicon Valley illusion. He was 34 years old, armed with a charismatic smile and a vocabulary built entirely on meaningless buzzwords. He sold concepts like synergy disruption and paradigm shifts to gullible angel investors, but he had never written a single line of viable code. His current venture was a vaporware platform promising to revolutionize artificial intelligence logistics. In reality, it was an empty shell company drowning in unpaid vendor invoices and desperate for a capital injection. My parents had just handed him my life savings to keep his fraudulent dream afloat. Armed with a stolen fortune, Brad immediately sought out the most visible symbol of tech success he could find. He wanted a throne. According to the GPS data scrubbed from his public social media posts, Brad was currently standing in the financial district of downtown San Francisco. He had arranged a private viewing of a sprawling commercial penthouse suite on Market Street. The space featured floor-to-ceiling glass, offering panoramic views of the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay. It was an architectural marvel of polished concrete, exposed steel, and imported hardwood. It was also one of the most expensive commercial rentals in the city. Through the digital portal provided by my holding company, I watched the leasing transaction unfold in real time. The commercial broker, a sharp-suited man operating on strict instructions from his corporate client, handed Brad a sleek leather binder containing the rental agreement. The broker played his part perfectly, flattering my brother, praising his visionary business model, and feeding his bloated ego. Brad strutted across the empty marble floor looking out over the city, convinced he had finally arrived at the top of the food chain. The broker directed Brad's attention to the specific terms of the contract. The lease mandated a 10-year commitment. It was a triple net agreement, meaning the tenant was responsible for all property taxes, building insurance, and maintenance costs on top of the exorbitant base rent. It was an unforgiving document designed to weed out unstable startups. "There is one final requirement, Mr. Jenkins," the broker stated, his tone practiced and smooth. "Because your tech firm is currently in the pre-revenue stage, the landlord requires a binding personal guarantee. The corporate entity offering the space, Apex Holdings, maintains strict risk management protocols. We need assurance that you possess the liquid capital to cover the obligations of this lease should the startup face any unexpected headwinds." Brad did not hesitate. He did not consult a lawyer. He was too high on the adrenaline of his stolen wealth to recognize the legal bear trap snapping open beneath his feet. He pulled his latest bank statement from his designer briefcase, proudly displaying the $2 million balance. He scoffed at the idea of headwinds, boasting that his company would reach unicorn valuation within the fiscal year. He took the provided luxury pen and scrawled his signature across the personal guarantee clause. He legally tethered his own identity to the financial obligations of the 10-year contract. He committed his current and future assets to satisfying the debt. Brad closed the leather binder, handing it back to the broker with a triumphant grin. He believed he had just outsmarted the rigid gatekeepers of the commercial real estate market. He thought he was renting a prestigious headquarters from a faceless corporate conglomerate. He never bothered to investigate the ownership structure of Apex Holdings. If he had hired a competent forensic accountant to trace the nested limited liability companies and offshore trusts, he would have discovered a terrifying truth. Apex Holdings was a subsidiary of my primary venture capital firm. I was the sole majority shareholder. I was the landlord. My brother had just signed a legally binding, unassailable contract agreeing to pay me millions of dollars in rent using the exact money he had stolen from my hospital bed. Furthermore, by signing the personal guarantee, he had bypassed the limited liability protections of his startup. When his vaporware company inevitably collapsed, I had the legal right to seize every single asset he owned to satisfy the remainder of the 10-year lease. He had forged his own chains, locked them around his neck, and handed me the key. To celebrate his supposed genius, Brad threw an extravagant launch party in the half-furnished penthouse that very weekend. He spared no expense, burning through the stolen cash with reckless abandon. He hired premium caterers, commissioned custom ice sculptures, and stocked the bars with top-shelf liquor. The room was packed with minor social media influencers, desperate venture capitalists, and superficial acquaintances. I monitored the event through the security cameras integrated into the building's fire suppression system. I watched Brad standing on a raised platform, wearing a bespoke, tailored suit, raising a glass of vintage champagne to the cheering crowd. He delivered a speech about overcoming adversity. He spoke passionately about the grueling hours of hustle required to build a visionary tech company from the ground up. He claimed his initial seed money came from a silent angel investor who believed in his unique potential. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He bathed in the applause, soaking up the unearned admiration, while my ribs still ached from the steering wheel impact that nearly ended my life. Back in the quiet sanctuary of the mountain clinic, the door to my suite opened. Victoria stepped into the room, holding a pristine manila envelope. She had flown up from the city specifically to deliver the executed documents. She pulled the countersigned lease agreement from the envelope and laid it on the mahogany table. I stood up, gripping my specialized orthopedic walker. I put weight on my reconstructed leg, feeling the sharp, productive ache of healing muscle and bone. I walked over to the table and looked down at Brad's arrogant, sprawling signature on the dotted line. He took the bait. Victoria noted, her voice a low hum of satisfaction. The personal guarantee is ironclad. He is legally obligated to transfer $60,000 a month back into your holding accounts for the next 120 months. When he defaults, we will initiate asset forfeiture proceedings. I traced the ink of his signature with my index finger. The physical pain in my leg faded entirely, replaced by the cold, profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed strategy. Brad thought he had secured a palace. He had actually rented a very expensive, very visible prison cell. We have secured the brother, I said, turning away from the table to look out the panoramic window at the snow-covered pines. He is trapped, and he does not even know the door is locked. Victoria placed the documents back into her briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut. The commercial trap is set. Now we turn our attention to the suppliers. I nodded, resting my hands on the grips of the walker. Richard and Susan were riding high on the success of their fraudulent real estate transaction. They had successfully funneled the cash to Brad and were now preparing to finalize the last step of their crime. They were scheduled to meet the cash buyer of my home tomorrow afternoon to hand over the physical keys and sign the final closing affidavits. They expected to meet a wealthy, naive investor looking for a quick property flip. They were anticipating a polite handshake and a smooth transition of ownership. They had no idea that the man walking up my driveway was a licensed private investigator wearing a high-definition wire, recording every single word they spoke directly to a federal evidence file. The morning sun illuminated the reinforced glass of my mountain rehabilitation suite, casting long, sharp shadows across the heated hardwood floor. I sat in a specialized ergonomic chair while a motorized brace slowly bent my reconstructed knee. The physical therapy was an agonizing, sharp, grinding torment that tested the very limits of my endurance. Yet my focus remained entirely fixed on the encrypted tablet resting on the mahogany table in front of me. Today was closing day. 200 miles south, the manicured lawns of my Silicon Valley neighborhood basked in the mild California weather. Richard and Susan stood in the driveway of the architectural masterpiece I had purchased 3 years prior. They had dressed for the occasion, shedding their usual middle-class department store garments for high-end designer labels bought on credit, anticipating the final, monumental payout. My father wore a tailored Italian blazer, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. My mother draped a silk scarf over her shoulders, her hair freshly styled at a premium salon. They looked like lottery winners, eagerly waiting to collect their oversized check. A sleek midnight blue luxury sedan glided up the driveway, crunching softly against the pristine gravel. The man who stepped out of the driver's seat looked every inch the wealthy, eccentric real estate tycoon they expected. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a platinum Rolex gleaming on his wrist, and carried a demeanor of polite, hurried impatience. My parents rushed forward to greet him, their faces stretched into eager, sycophantic smiles. They knew him as Marcus Sterling, a cash-heavy investor looking to expand his property portfolio. They did not know his true background. Sterling was not a real estate flipper. He was a former tactical operative for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a seasoned specialist in white-collar crime whom Victoria retained exclusively for high-stakes corporate espionage. Woven seamlessly into the lapel of his expensive jacket was a microscopic, military-grade button camera. Every sycophantic greeting, every greedy grin, and every spoken syllable was actively transmitting via a secure cellular uplink directly to Detective Liam Gallagher and his federal evidence server. Before ushering Sterling inside, Susan noticed Mrs. Gable, my elderly next-door neighbor, retrieving her mail from the curb. Instantly, the greedy excitement vanished from my mother's face, replaced by a mask of profound manufactured sorrow. Susan pressed a manicured hand to her chest, her shoulders slumping as she waved weakly to the older woman. She pulled a lace handkerchief from her designer purse, dabbing at eyes that held no actual tears. "It is just so incredibly difficult," Susan projected, ensuring her voice carried across the manicured hedges. "Walking through these halls without our sweet girl is a nightmare. We are only selling because the memories are simply too painful to bear." Richard wrapped a comforting arm around her shoulders, playing the role of the stoic patriarch holding his family together through an unimaginable tragedy. I watched the live feed from my tablet, my fingernails digging into the armrests of my chair. The sheer audacity of their performance was nauseating. They were monetizing my supposed demise, extracting sympathy from a sweet old lady, while simultaneously liquidating my sanctuary. Sterling nodded sympathetically, his face a perfect mask of polite condolence, while his hidden camera captured the entire fraudulent display in crystal-clear 4K resolution. They guided the investigator through the heavy oak front doors. The interior of the home had already been stripped of my personal touches, my framed degrees, the abstract paintings I had curated from local artists, and the photographs of my travels had all been unceremoniously boxed up and shoved into the garage. In their place, Richard had staged the living room to look like a generic luxury showroom. My father marched straight to the kitchen island, retrieving a chilled bottle of my most exclusive champagne. He popped the cork with a festive, resounding crack, pouring 3 generous flutes. "To new beginnings, Marcus," Richard boasted, handing a crystal glass to the undercover agent. "And to a seamless transaction. We appreciate your ability to close so quickly. Dealing with traditional buyers who rely on bank financing is always such a tedious headache." Sterling accepted the glass but did not take a sip. He set the champagne down on the marble counter, his posture shifting from casual investor to meticulous businessman. He unlatched a slim leather briefcase, retrieving the final stack of closing documents. "The swiftness of this transaction is precisely why I require total certainty regarding the chain of title," Sterling stated, his voice a calm, authoritative baritone. "As you know, purchasing a property from an estate rather than the living owner carries inherent risks. I need to be assured that there will be no legal entanglements. Are you certain there are no other siblings, estranged spouses, or hidden beneficiaries who might contest this sale?" This was the critical moment. Victoria and Gallagher had choreographed this interaction to corner my parents legally. If Richard admitted to my existence, or if he expressed any doubt, he might establish a defense of ignorance. We needed him to double down on the lie with undeniable intent. My father chuckled a condescending, arrogant sound that grated against my ears. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded legal document, slapping it onto the marble island with triumphant finality. "You worry too much," Marcus Richards scoffed, leaning against the counter. "My daughter was a quiet, solitary workaholic. No husband and no kids. When she passed away from her injuries last week, my wife and I became the sole, undisputed heirs to her entire estate. We handled everything. Sterling picked up the paper, his hidden camera getting a perfect, unobstructed view of the forged power of attorney and the fabricated municipal death certificate Richard had purchased from the dark web. "I see," the investigator murmured, examining the fraudulent seals. "But bypassing the probate courts entirely is quite a feat. Most families get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape for months." Richard could not resist the opportunity to brag. His ego, bloated by the sudden influx of stolen cash, demanded recognition. "The probate system is designed to trap the uneducated," my father boasted, sipping his stolen wine. "I know how to navigate the legal loopholes. I filed the necessary affidavits directly with the county clerk, presenting this medical proxy and asserting our status as immediate next of kin. We streamlined the process to avoid unnecessary taxes and delays. It is entirely foolproof." Susan chimed in, eager to solidify the illusion. "Angela trusted us implicitly," my mother lied, her voice dripping with venomous deceit. "She left everything in our capable hands. Signing these final closing papers is merely fulfilling her ultimate wishes." Sterling nodded, his expression giving away nothing of the federal snare that had just snapped shut around them. "Well, that is certainly thorough," he conceded, sliding the final signature pages toward them. "If you will just endorse these affidavits confirming everything you have just stated, the property will officially change hands." Richard and Susan snatched the provided pens. They did not read the fine print. They did not realize they were signing sworn federal declarations under penalty of perjury. They scrawled their names with greedy, hurried strokes, legally attesting to my death and claiming ownership of a home they never paid a dime for. My father gathered the heavy brass keys from the counter, dropping them into Sterling's palm with a metallic clink. "The house is yours, Marcus," Richard declared, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of the $2.5 million currently sitting in his checking account. "Enjoy it," Sterling thanked them, gathered the damning evidence into his briefcase, and walked out the front door. I watched the live feed as the dark sedan rolled down the driveway and disappeared down the suburban street. Back in the kitchen, my parents erupted into joyous, uninhibited celebration. They embraced, laughing loudly, entirely unaware that the man who just drove away was driving straight to a secure FBI field office. They believed they had committed the perfect crime, securing a fortune that would elevate them into the upper echelons of society. They were so confident in their new status that Susan had already begun planning her next move. She was organizing a lavish, highly publicized memorial fundraiser at their exclusive country club, intending to parade her fake grief in front of the local elite to solicit even more money. She was preparing to mount a grand stage, utterly blind to the fact that I was currently standing in the wings, holding the detonator that would blow her entire world to pieces. The high-altitude air of the private mountain clinic felt crisp against my skin. I sat upright in a customized, ergonomic wheelchair positioned squarely in front of a sophisticated multi-monitor array. The orthopedic braces encasing my reconstructed right leg hummed with a quiet, steady mechanical rhythm. The physical pain was a dull, persistent throb, but my focus remained laser-sharp. On my primary screen, a live broadcast streamed in pristine high definition, bringing the ultimate betrayal directly into my recovery suite. 2 weeks had passed since Richard handed the keys of my Silicon Valley fortress to an undercover federal agent. Buoyed by their stolen $2.5 million, my parents required a public stage to legitimize their newly acquired affluence. They chose the prestigious Oakmont Valley Country Club. It was a sprawling enclave of manicured golf courses, towering oak trees, and entrenched old money elitism. Growing up, Richard and Susan could barely afford the basic social membership, scraping together monthly dues just to rub elbows with local politicians and corporate executives. Tonight, they were the guests of honor, commanding the entire grand ballroom. Susan stood at the center of the room, bathed in the warm golden glow of cascading crystal chandeliers. She wore a custom-tailored black silk gown that retailed for $15,000. The luxurious fabric draped elegantly around her frame, accented by a blinding diamond tennis bracelet she had purchased 48 hours prior using my hijacked routing numbers. She held a microphone in one hand and a delicate lace handkerchief in the other, playing the role of the devastated matriarch to flawless perfection. This was her ultimate masterpiece. For my entire life, Susan treated me not as a daughter, but as a convenient conversational prop. I recalled my university graduation where I delivered the valedictory address after securing a full academic scholarship. Richard skipped the ceremony to attend a regional golf tournament. Susan arrived an hour late, complaining about the parking, and immediately demanded I co-sign a high-interest personal loan to cover Brad's failing grades at a private tutoring academy. I refused, marking the beginning of our deep, unspoken estrangement. I was the silent workhorse, expected to generate prestige, while Brad absorbed the actual affection and financial support. The large silk banner hanging above the ballroom stage read, "The Angela Sterling Memorial Gala." It was an extravagant affair featuring imported caviar, seared scallops, and a live string quartet playing mournful classical arrangements. Surrounding the perimeter of the room were silent auction tables and large floral displays carrying custom QR codes. Susan was not merely hosting a party to mourn my fabricated demise. She was actively soliciting donations from the wealthiest families in the county. The camera panned across the crowd, capturing Brad standing near the mahogany bar. My brother wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo, his hair styled with immaculate precision. He nodded solemnly as a local tech executive patted his shoulder, offering deep condolences. As soon as the executive walked away, Brad pulled out his smartphone. He was not reading messages of support. Through my secondary monitor, I had mirrored the network traffic of the event's digital donation portal. I watched the incoming transaction logs update in real time. Every single dollar the country club elite contributed to my fake memorial foundation was being immediately routed through a series of digital wash accounts. The money bypassed standard nonprofit holding periods, slipping through a deliberately misconfigured routing protocol straight into the commercial ledger of Brad's vaporware startup. They were monetizing my supposed death to fund a fraudulent technology company. The sheer clinical depravity of the scheme took my breath away. They were swindling their own friends, neighbors, and business associates, hiding behind the impenetrable shield of a grieving family. No one questions a weeping mother. No one audits a memorial fund while the tragedy is still fresh in the minds of the community. Susan stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to quiet the murmuring crowd. The room fell into a respectful hush. My sweet Angela was a beacon of light. Susan projected her voice, trembling with practiced theatrical precision. She worked so tirelessly to build a better future. Her sudden passing left a void in our hearts that can never be filled. But Richard and I decided that her legacy must live on. That is why we established this foundation. Every contribution you make tonight goes directly to funding visionary young entrepreneurs, honoring Angela's passion for innovation. I watched a prominent state senator write a check for $10,000 and drop it into a crystal collection bowl. The senator believed he was funding academic scholarships for underprivileged youth. In reality, he was paying the first month of rent for Brad's sprawling downtown penthouse office. The very same office Brad had blindly leased from my hidden commercial holding company. The cyclical nature of their theft was sheer poetry. They were stealing from the rich to pay me back with my own stolen money, while implicating themselves in a sprawling interstate wire fraud conspiracy. The gala proved to be a staggering success for their criminal enterprise. By my calculations, they had collected over $400,000 in illicit donations within the first 2 hours. The cash buyer charade had secured them a fortune, and now they were actively expanding their fraudulent footprint. Richard mingled near a towering ice sculpture, accepting handshakes and backslaps, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He truly believed he had beaten the system. He thought the rules of society did not apply to his unique brilliance. I zoomed the camera feed in on Susan's face. She was smiling. It was a micro-expression, a brief flash of genuine, triumphant euphoria breaking through the facade of a mourning mother. She was high on the attention, high on the stolen wealth, and high on the power of her successful deception. She looked invincible, surveying the ballroom like a queen ruling over her newly conquered kingdom. I closed the video application on my primary screen. The theater portion of this war was officially concluded. Victoria and Detective Gallagher had spent the last fortnight preparing the judicial paperwork. A federal judge had already reviewed the preliminary evidence compiled from the undercover real estate closing. We held sealed warrants waiting for execution. By allowing the gala to proceed, we elevated the charges from simple familial theft to a coordinated racketeering enterprise. The volume of high-profile victims had just increased, guaranteeing swift, unyielding federal jurisdiction. I picked up my secure, encrypted smartphone. The screen illuminated the dim recovery room, casting a pale blue light across my face. I watched Susan raise a glass of vintage champagne to the crowd, bathing in a standing ovation. She was soaking in the applause, a parasite feeding on the goodwill of strangers. My fingers traced the cold glass screen, tapping the single speed dial icon resting on the home display. The line connected instantly, ringing through the secure server to Victoria's private office in San Francisco. The brilliant attorney answered without a greeting, waiting in the silence for my command. I looked out the panoramic window at the dark, jagged outline of the mountain peaks, breathing in the sanitized air of my suite. The titanium in my leg throbbed, sending a sharp, physical reminder of the brutal discard I had survived. The net was fully woven, the bait had been swallowed whole. It was time to pull the strings tight. Victoria. I said, my voice low, smooth, and devoid of any hesitation. The guests have emptied their wallets. The accounts are fully loaded. Freeze everything. The morning sun breached the horizon, illuminating the sprawling Silicon Valley suburbs in a wash of pale golden light. I sat in my quiet mountain rehabilitation suite, sipping herbal tea while observing the digital landscape of my enemies. The previous night, my family had bathed in the unearned glory of their fraudulent memorial gala. They woke up this morning believing they were the newly minted aristocracy of Northern California. They thought the wealth they had siphoned from my supposed demise had secured their legacy forever. They were blissfully unaware that Victoria had spent the twilight hours filing the necessary injunctions to dismantle their stolen empire. Richard had spent his entire adulthood resenting the affluent executives he managed at his mid-level corporate job. He harbored a toxic entitlement, believing he was destined for greatness while blaming the economy for his chronic mediocrity. He viewed my financial success as a personal insult, often demanding loans he never intended to repay. Now flush with the stolen proceeds from my real estate transaction, he intended to rewrite his narrative. He drove his outdated sedan to the premier European auto dealership in San Jose, intending to leave his old life in the visitor lot forever. He strode across the pristine showroom floor, his leather shoes squeaking softly against the polished tiles. He bypassed the entry-level vehicles, aiming directly for a sleek, silver Porsche 911 Turbo. The sticker price was staggering, but Richard felt invincible. He beckoned a young, eager salesman, demanding the keys and tossing his premium debit card onto the glass desk. He boasted about paying in full, waving away any discussion of financing with a condescending flick of his wrist. The salesman smiled, anticipating a lucrative commission, and slid the plastic through the transaction terminal. The machine whirred, processing the request before emitting a harsh, dissonant beep. The word "declined" flashed across the digital display. Richard scoffed, adjusting his silk tie. He blamed a daily spending limit, instructing the employee to run it again. The salesman keyed the numbers manually. The screen glowed red, displaying a terrifying directive, instructing the merchant to confiscate the card and contact the issuer immediately. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He snatched the plastic back, his arrogant facade cracking under the sudden, crushing weight of public embarrassment. He muttered a frantic excuse and hurried out the glass doors, his dream car remaining firmly on the showroom floor. 30 miles north, Susan was experiencing an identical catastrophe. She strolled into the flagship Neiman Marcus boutique in downtown San Francisco, still riding the euphoric high of her theatrical performance at the fundraiser. She equated material possessions with emotional validation, a coping mechanism that frequently plunged our family into severe debt during my childhood. Whenever she felt inadequate, she purchased expensive jewelry, ignoring the mounting collection notices. Today, she gravitated toward the fine jewelry counters, her eyes locking on to a breathtaking platinum tennis bracelet. She pointed a manicured finger at the display case, instructing the clerk to wrap the item without asking the price. She handed over her matching debit card, anticipating the satisfying rustle of premium shopping bags. The clerk processed the payment. The register hesitated, churning out a jagged printed receipt. The employee frowned, offering a strained, polite apology indicating the account was restricted. Susan turned a vivid shade of crimson. She rummaged through her designer purse, producing 3 backup credit cards linked to their joint profile. Every single attempt returned the exact same fatal error. The clerk stared at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, recognizing the familiar panic of a customer whose finances had just evaporated. The surrounding shoppers glanced over, whispering among themselves. Susan grabbed her purse, fleeing the boutique to escape the suffocating humiliation. The thrill of her stolen wealth dissolved into a cold, creeping dread. High above the financial district, Brad sat behind a sprawling concrete desk in his newly leased commercial penthouse. He nursed a lingering headache from his extravagant launch celebration, pouring himself a cup of imported espresso. The premium catering company had just emailed their final invoice for the imported liquor and gourmet appetizers. Brad cracked his knuckles, opening his secure corporate banking portal to authorize the wire transfer. He had spent his entire life coasting on unearned praise, shielded from the consequences of his failures by my enabling parents. He firmly believed his vaporware startup was on the verge of revolutionizing the tech industry, despite possessing 0 viable code. He typed his password, anticipating the comforting sight of his 7-figure balance generated by the country club donations and the real estate theft. The interface loaded slowly before locking him out entirely. A stark gray text box informed him that his routing number was suspended pending a federal compliance review. He refreshed the browser frantically. He restarted his computer, his palms sweating against the keyboard. The result remained identical. His stolen capital had vanished into the digital ether, leaving him with a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices and an unforgiving 10-year lease. His phone began to ring. It was the catering manager demanding payment. Brad ignored the call, his heart hammering against his ribs as the illusion of his tech empire crumbled around him. They did not realize that the swift execution of their ruin was an orchestrated masterpiece. At exactly 8 a.m, Victoria had marched into the county courthouse, filing an emergency title dispute on the escrow account that handled the fraudulent sale of my home. Simultaneously, Detective Gallagher submitted a preliminary warrant citing credible suspicion of interstate wire fraud. These synchronized actions triggered an automatic, non-negotiable federal freeze on every financial instrument connected to the Jenkins family. The net had pulled taut. In a matter of 10 minutes, my parents and my brother transitioned from arrogant millionaires to penniless suspects. They stood at cash registers and computer screens across the state, their faces draining of color as the mirage of their supremacy evaporated. The safety net they stole from me was gone. The financial sabotage was merely the opening act. The psychological terror would begin when they realized they could not simply walk away from the mess they created. The sudden lack of funds would force them to seek answers, exposing their crimes to further scrutiny. Desperation is a powerful catalyst for terrible decisions. Richard was already storming out of the dealership parking lot, preparing to march into the escrow office to demand his money. He was entirely unaware he was walking directly into a bureaucratic snare designed to secure his federal prison sentence. Richard drove with reckless desperation. His knuckles turned white against the worn leather steering wheel of his outdated sedan. Just 30 minutes prior, he was sitting in the driver's seat of a pristine Porsche, anticipating a life of unrivaled luxury. Now the bitter taste of public rejection coated his throat. He swerved through the midday traffic of the financial district, his mind racing to formulate an explanation for the humiliating decline at the dealership. He refused to entertain the idea that his newfound wealth was in jeopardy. In his mind, this was merely a clerical error, a bureaucratic oversight perpetrated by an incompetent bank teller. He pulled into the parking structure of the elite escrow firm that had handled the fraudulent sale of my Silicon Valley estate. He did not bother straightening his tie or smoothing his blazer. He marched through the revolving glass doors with the unearned swagger of a billionaire offended by a minor inconvenience. He bypassed the receptionist entirely, ignoring her polite protests, and pushed his way into the expansive corner office of the senior escrow agent. The woman sitting behind the polished mahogany desk was named Ms. Caldwell. She was a seasoned professional known for her impeccable discretion and unyielding adherence to property law. She also happened to be a cooperating witness, fully briefed by Detective Gallagher and Victoria. She knew the man standing before her was a thief. She knew the transaction she facilitated was a carefully orchestrated federal sting operation. Yet her expression remained a flawless mask of corporate hospitality. Richard slammed his palms flat against the smooth surface of her desk. He demanded to know why his routing numbers were suspended. He raised his voice, projecting the entitled fury of a man who believed volume could compensate for a lack of leverage. He accused her firm of incompetence, threatening to file a lawsuit for withholding his capital. Ms. Caldwell did not flinch. She allowed his tantrum to run its course, observing him with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a rat navigate a maze. When he finally paused to draw a breath, she folded her hands neatly over a pristine manila folder. "Please take a seat, Mr. Sterling." She offered her voice a calm, steady hum that immediately neutralized his bluster. "We are facing a rather delicate compliance issue regarding the transfer of your late daughter's estate." The word compliance struck Richard like a physical blow. He lowered himself into the leather guest chair, the anger draining from his posture, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He had spent his entire professional career cutting corners. He was the type of mid-level manager who padded expense reports, manipulated quarterly projections, and believed the rules only applied to the uneducated. He had always managed to bluff his way out of trouble, but the tone of Ms. Caldwell's voice suggested this obstacle could not be intimidated into submission. As you are aware, Ms. Caldwell continued maintaining her piercing eye contact. The swiftness of this transaction was highly irregular. Bypassing the standard probate courts is permissible under specific guidelines, but it triggers automatic risk assessments within the federal banking network. The holding institution flagged the $2.5 million transfer this morning. They placed a hard freeze on the capital, pending a title dispute verification. Richard felt the collar of his shirt growing damp with sweat. He stammered, attempting to inject a tone of grieving indignation into his response. He reiterated the lie he had told the undercover agent, insisting that I was dead and that he and Susan were the sole, undisputed heirs. He demanded she lift the restriction, claiming the delay was causing his family undue emotional distress. Ms. Caldwell offered a sympathetic nod, acknowledging his performance without validating it. "I understand your frustration, sir," she replied. "However, the bank requires a final, definitive layer of legal protection before they will release the hold. They cannot rely solely on the municipal death certificate and the medical proxy you provided." She opened the manila folder and extracted a single heavy sheet of bond paper. She rotated the document, sliding it across the desk toward him. It bore the imposing seal of a federal banking commission. This is a sworn affidavit of decedent status and sole heirship, Ms. Caldwell explained, tapping the signature line with a silver pen. It is a binding federal declaration. By signing this, you are swearing, under penalty of perjury, that Angela Sterling is officially deceased, that no other living beneficiaries exist, and that you are legally entitled to liquidate her assets. The silence in the office grew heavy, suffocating the room in a thick layer of tension. Richard stared at the document. The bold black text seemed to blur before his eyes. This was the ultimate crossroad. If you decline to sign, Ms. Caldwell added, her tone perfectly neutral, the funds will remain frozen indefinitely. The entire transaction will be remanded to the probate courts for a comprehensive audit which could take years to untangle. He was staring into the abyss. If he stood up and walked away, he would lose the millions. He would have to return to his suffocating suburban mediocrity, drowning in the debt he had accrued over a lifetime of keeping up appearances. He would have to face Susan and admit they were destitute. He would have to tell Brad the tech startup was dead. The thought of returning to a life of financial irrelevance terrified him far more than the threat of a prison sentence. Greed is a blinding, intoxicating poison. It convinces the infected that they are immune to the consequences of their own actions. I sat in my mountain recovery suite listening to the live audio feed transmitting from a concealed microphone Victoria had planted in the escrow office earlier that morning. I heard the erratic, shallow rhythm of my father's breathing. I knew the exact mathematical equation calculating in his head. He was weighing the certainty of poverty against the slim possibility of getting caught. Richard reached for the silver pen. His hand trembled, a slight, uncontrollable vibration betraying the monumental risk he was about to take. He pressed the ink to the paper. The scratch of the nib against the thick parchment echoed through the audio feed, loud and definitive. He signed his name with a jagged, hurried flourish. He did not merely forge a document. He swore a fraudulent oath to the United States government. He crossed the threshold from opportunistic familial theft into the realm of severe federal felony perjury. There, Richard breathed his voice tight and breathless. It is signed. Now clear the flag and release my money. Miss Caldwell retrieved the document, inspecting the signature with a practiced eye. She pulled a heavy brass stamp from her drawer, bringing it down onto the paper with a resounding, final crack. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, placing the executed affidavit into a secure lockbox. "I will transmit this to the Compliance Division immediately. You will be notified the moment the review is concluded." Richard stood up, straightening his jacket, attempting to reclaim his shattered dignity. He offered a curt nod and marched out of the office, believing he had just outsmarted a trillion-dollar banking system. He walked toward the elevators, feeling the euphoric rush of a gambler who had pushed all his chips into the center of the table and won. He had no idea he had just handed Detective Gallagher the final, undeniable piece of evidence required to secure a decade-long prison sentence. He had built his own gallows, inspected the trapdoor, and placed the noose firmly around his own neck. While my father was riding the elevator down to the lobby, basking in the false glow of his perceived victory, the consequences of their shattered financial facade were already detonating elsewhere. Richard thought he had bought them time to maintain their illusions of grandeur, but the asset freeze was unyielding, and its effects were immediate. As he stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, utterly ignorant of his impending doom, my mother was preparing to face her own brutal reckoning. Susan was about to step into the lion's den of her exclusive country club, hoping to salvage her bruised ego, completely oblivious to the fact that her credit lines were dead and her social standing was about to be publicly eradicated. While Richard was stepping out of the escrow office building, believing he had just secured a lifetime of unearned luxury, my mother was already sitting in the center of her own impending disaster. Susan had retreated to the Oakmont Valley Country Club, seeking refuge from the horrifying decline of her debit card at the jewelry boutique earlier that morning. She convinced herself the banking error was a temporary glitch, a minor inconvenience that would be resolved the moment Richard finished his paperwork. She needed validation. She needed an audience to confirm her elevated status. The main dining room of the country club represented the pinnacle of suburban elitism. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the pristine 18th hole, bathing the white linen tables in warm, natural light. Crystal chandeliers hung above, casting a soft glow over the silver cutlery and imported floral centerpieces. Susan occupied the premier table in the center of the room. She was hosting an extravagant brunch for 4 highly influential women, including the wives of 2 state senators and a prominent local judge. These women were not her friends. In the ruthless hierarchy of high society, true friendship is a myth. These women were human shields and status symbols. Susan had spent her entire adulthood chasing their approval. She grew up wearing inexpensive clothes and harboring a deep, suffocating resentment toward anyone born into privilege. She married my father because he projected the illusion of future wealth, an illusion that quickly shattered under the weight of his chronic corporate mediocrity. For 3 decades, Susan compensated by plunging our family into secret debt, purchasing designer handbags she could not afford, just to sit at this exact table and pretend she belonged. Today, she felt she finally possessed the financial backing to match her ambition. She wore her $15,000 black silk gown from the Memorial Gala, repurposing it for daytime elegance. She ordered imported beluga caviar truffles and 3 bottles of vintage champagne. She spared 0 expense, eager to demonstrate her bottomless liquidity. The senators' wives happily consumed the decadent spread, offering hollow, manufactured sympathies regarding my fabricated death. Susan played her role flawlessly. She sighed deeply, staring out at the manicured golf course, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She recounted the fictitious story of my sudden passing, weaving a narrative of tragic heroism, while ensuring the conversation inevitably circled back to the vast estate Richard and she were now managing. She was purchasing their respect, using my stolen money to buy a seat at the top of the social pyramid. The extravagant meal stretched for 2 hours. As the waiters cleared the empty crystal dessert plates, Susan signaled for the check. She offered a magnanimous smile, waving her hand to insist she was covering the entire exorbitant bill. She expected the waiter to return with a discreet black leather folder allowing her to scrawl her signature and charge the feast directly to her member account. Instead, the waiter did not return. The heavy mahogany doors leading to the kitchen swung open, and the general manager of the club walked out. Mr. Harrison was a meticulous man, with silver hair and an impeccable tailored suit. For years he had tolerated my mother and her haughty demands, treating her with the practiced obsequious politeness required of his position. Today, his posture was distinctly different. His shoulders were rigid, and his expression resembled carved stone. He approached the center table carrying a printed ledger rather than a standard receipt folder. The lively conversation among the senators' wives faded into an uncomfortable silence. They sensed the sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. Mr. Harrison stopped directly beside Susan. He did not lean down to whisper. He stood tall, ensuring his voice projected clearly, carrying across the quiet hum of the busy dining room. Mrs. Sterling, the manager, began his tone frigid and devoid of any customary hospitality. "I regret to inform you that we cannot process this transaction." Susan laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound that grated against the crystal glasses. She glanced at her guests, offering an apologetic smile. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, please stop joking," she deflected, her cheeks flushing a pale shade of pink. "Just charge it to our member account. Richard updated the routing information just yesterday. We have more than enough capital to cover a simple brunch." Mr. Harrison did not smile. He did not lower his voice. "I am well aware of the routing update you submitted, Mrs. Sterling," he replied, staring down at her. "That is precisely the issue. Our accounting department attempted to authorize the charge through your new financial institution. The transaction was rejected due to critical, insufficient funds. Furthermore, the bank notified our corporate office that the account in question is currently locked under a federal fraud investigation." The words "federal fraud investigation" hung in the air like toxic smoke. The surrounding tables stopped eating. Diners turned their heads, their forks hovering midair, captivated by the unfolding scandal. Susan felt the breath leave her lungs. Her face turned a violent shade of crimson, the color spreading down her neck and chest. She stammered, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she reached for her designer purse. She attempted to salvage the situation, digging frantically for a physical credit card. "This is an outrageous misunderstanding," Susan hissed, keeping her voice low in a desperate bid to contain the damage. "You are causing a scene, Mr. Harrison. Take this platinum card and run it immediately. My husband is finalizing a multi-million-dollar real estate transfer as we speak." Mr. Harrison ignored the plastic card trembling in her fingers. He signaled toward the dining room entrance. Two large men wearing dark security blazers stepped forward, moving with swift, deliberate purpose. "Your membership privileges are revoked, effective immediately," the manager announced, finalizing her social execution. "Our bylaws strictly prohibit associating the Oakmont Valley Country Club with active criminal investigations. We will be forwarding this outstanding balance to a collection agency. You need to vacate the premises right now." The social abandonment was instantaneous and brutal. In the world of the political elite, financial scandal is a highly contagious disease. The senators' wives did not offer to help. They did not ask clarifying questions or defend her honor. They stood up in unison, grabbing their luxury handbags and silk scarves. One muttered a hollow excuse about a sudden charity board meeting. Another refused to even look in her direction, turning her back and walking swiftly toward the terrace exit. They fled the table, leaving Susan sitting alone in a sea of empty champagne flutes and half-eaten caviar. Susan sat paralyzed. The power she thought she purchased had evaporated in less than 60 seconds. The security guards reached the table, standing on either side of her chair. They did not touch her, but their presence was an undeniable threat. "Ma'am," one of the guards stated, his voice rough and uncompromising, "it is time to leave." Susan stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She gathered her purse, clutching it to her chest like a shield. She was forced to walk the entire length of the grand dining room. It was a gauntlet of supreme humiliation. Every single eye in the room tracked her exit. The women she had spent decades trying to impress were now whispering behind their hands, looking at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. The $15,000 gown she wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. She pushed through the glass doors and stumbled out into the scorching afternoon heat of the parking lot. The valet brought her car around, refusing to make eye contact. Susan climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut to block out the harsh reality of the outside world. She gripped the steering wheel, her chest heaving with dry, ragged sobs. She had been stripped of her dignity, her wealth, and her social standing, all in a single devastating afternoon. She pulled her phone from her purse, scrolling frantically with shaking fingers to find my father's contact. She needed Richard to fix this. She needed him to assure her that the money was secure and this nightmare was just a temporary misunderstanding. She hit dial, bringing the phone to her ear. The line rang endlessly, echoing the hollow emptiness of her shattered life. She had no idea that Richard was currently incapable of comforting her. The financial freeze was a devastating blow, but the psychological warfare was just beginning to escalate. While Susan wept in her car, Richard was sitting in his own vehicle, staring at a blocked caller ID on his phone. The phantom phone calls from the undercover investigator were about to commence, driving my father into a dark, desperate corner, where his only remaining option would be to commit an entirely new, unforgivable crime. The oppressive midday heat radiated through the windshield of my father's outdated sedan, baking the worn leather interior. Richard sat in the parking structure of the escrow building, drenched in a cold, terrified sweat. He stared blankly at the concrete pillar in front of his bumper, his mind struggling to process the catastrophic warning the escrow agent had delivered. The $2.5 million were trapped behind a bureaucratic wall. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, intending to call Susan and devise a strategy to navigate the delay. Before his thumb could tap her contact photo, the screen illuminated with an incoming call from a blocked caller identification. Richard hesitated. He cleared his dry throat, adjusting his silk tie, and tapped the answer icon, hoping it was the bank calling to apologize for a system error. Instead, a low, uncompromising voice echoed through the vehicle speakers. It was Marcus Sterling, the affluent investor who had purchased my Silicon Valley estate just hours prior. Sterling no longer sounded like the polite, eager businessman sipping vintage champagne in my kitchen. His tone was jagged and ruthless, carrying the distinct predatory edge of a corporate titan who had just uncovered a profound deception. Mr. Sterling, the undercover investigator, began skipping any customary greeting. My legal team just received a highly disturbing notification from the county title registry. They placed a hard stop on the transfer of the deed. The registrar informed my attorneys that the medical proxy you provided is insufficient to clear the chain of ownership. They require an official municipal death certificate bearing a verified state seal. Richard felt the remaining oxygen evacuate his lungs. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning a stark shade of white. He attempted to inject a tone of confident reassurance into his response, projecting the illusion of control. "Marcus, please do not worry," Richard stammered, his voice betraying a faint, pathetic quiver. "The bureaucracy is always slow. My wife and I are grieving, and the county clerk promised to expedite the vital records by the end of the month. The funds are secure. We just need a little patience." Patience is a luxury reserved for transparent transactions. Sterling countered his words, striking like a hammer against an anvil. "I wired a fortune into that escrow account based on your sworn assurance that the title was clear. If you cannot produce the verified municipal death certificate by Friday afternoon, I am pulling my capital. Furthermore, I will instruct my litigation team to file a civil suit against you for treble damages, citing intentional misrepresentation and breach of contract. You will owe me 3 times the value of the estate." The line went dead. The silence inside the sweltering car was deafening. Richard stared at the darkened screen, the threat of treble damages echoing relentlessly in his skull. $7.5 million. That was the magnitude of the financial ruin hanging over his head. If Sterling walked away, my father would not just return to his mundane suburban poverty, he would be sued into perpetual generational bankruptcy. Richard threw the vehicle into gear, tearing out of the parking structure with reckless desperation. He drove back to their quiet suburban neighborhood, running 2 red lights along the way. He burst through the front door of their home, expecting to find Susan organizing her social calendar or cataloging her recent luxury purchases. Instead, the house was shrouded in suffocating darkness. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the afternoon sun. Susan sat slumped on the living room sofa, wearing the crumpled $15,000 black silk gown from the memorial fundraiser. Mascara stained her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. Several empty wine bottles littered the mahogany coffee table. She had fled the Oakmont Valley Country Club an exiled pariah and collapsed into a puddle of self-pity. Richard demanded to know what happened, but before Susan could articulate her humiliating expulsion, the house phone began to ring. It was Brad, calling from his downtown commercial penthouse. My father put the call on speakerphone, expecting his golden child to offer a solution. Brad sounded feral. His voice cracked with genuine, unadulterated panic. The catering company locked the doors to the launch party. Brad shrieked the audio, distorting through the speaker. "My commercial bank account is frozen. The investors are demanding to see the capitalization tables, and the property manager just handed me a 10-day notice to cure the lease default. Dad, you promised me the wire transfer cleared. Where is my money?" Richard stood in the center of the darkened living room, surrounded by the imploding wreckage of his family. His wife was a disgraced outcast, weeping into expensive silk. His son was a fraudulent CEO, facing imminent commercial eviction. The stolen wealth they worshipped had evaporated, leaving them exposed to devastating legal consequences. "Shut up," Richard roared, silencing his wife and his son in a single breath. "The bank requires a final piece of paperwork to release the hold. I am handling it. Do not call anyone and do not leave this house." He terminated the call, marching straight into his home office and locking the door behind him. During his tenure as a supply chain logistics manager, my father often navigated the murky gray areas of corporate procurement. He frequently utilized questionable overseas vendors to undercut standard pricing, skimming the difference to fund his chronic gambling habit. He possessed a fundamental understanding of how to operate in the digital shadows. He booted up his desktop computer, installing a specialized encrypted browser. He navigated away from the indexed internet, plunging into the chaotic, unregulated depths of the dark web. He required a master forger capable of fabricating a document that could withstand the intense scrutiny of a federal title company. Within an hour, he located a digital broker specializing in elite identity fabrication. Richard initiated an encrypted text exchange detailing his exact requirements. He needed a flawless California municipal death certificate for Angela Sterling, complete with raised watermarks, authentic registry numbers, and a verifiable state seal. The forger responded with a stark, non-negotiable demand. The price for a document of that caliber, capable of bypassing a federal audit, was $50,000. Payable immediately in untraceable cryptocurrency. Richard stared at the glowing monitor. His stolen millions were trapped behind a bureaucratic freeze. His premium credit cards were suspended. He possessed exactly one remaining asset capable of generating that level of immediate liquid capital. It was his legitimate corporate retirement fund, a modest 401k account he had slowly built over 30 years of soul-crushing cubicle work. To save his stolen future, he had to incinerate his actual past. He logged into his retirement portal, staring at the balance that represented his entire lifetime of honest labor. He clicked the liquidation button, absorbing the devastating early withdrawal penalties and the severe tax liabilities, without a second thought. He routed the cash through a series of digital tumbling services, converting his retirement safety net into untraceable digital currency. He transmitted the $50,000 to the anonymous forger, watching his legitimate wealth vanish into the dark web. High in the remote mountain clinic, I watched the entire catastrophic sequence unfold on my primary monitor. Sitting beside me, Victoria sipped a cup of black coffee, her eyes tracking the encrypted data packets intercepted by my security team. Detective Gallagher stood near the panoramic window, listening to the audio feed transmitted from the malware we had discreetly embedded in my father's personal computer months ago. He just liquidated his pension. Victoria noted, her tone a mixture of clinical awe and profound disgust. He burned his only clean money to finance a cybercrime. Gallagher shook his head, pulling a small notebook from his trench coat. Transmitting funds to an unlicensed dark web entity to procure a fraudulent government document elevates this from state-level forgery to a severe federal conspiracy. He is burying himself so deep a backhoe could not dig him out. I leaned back in my ergonomic wheelchair, feeling the productive ache in my reconstructed leg. Richard believed he had outsmarted the escrow agency. He expected the forged certificate to arrive via a dead-drop courier the following morning, securing his path to unimaginable wealth. He was entirely blind to the fact that every digital keystroke, every desperate text message, and every single cent of that cryptocurrency transfer resided safely inside a federal evidence file. The physical forged document arrived at their suburban doorstep 24 hours later, hidden inside an unassuming, padded envelope. Richard tore it open, inspecting the raised seal and the meticulous typography. He smiled, a greedy, triumphant grin, showing the counterfeit masterpiece to Susan. They poured a fresh glass of wine, convinced they had successfully navigated the storm and secured their unearned paradise. They prepared to drive back to the escrow office to deliver the final key to their stolen fortune. But before Richard could reach for his car keys, his mobile phone chimed with an incoming notification. It was not the undercover investigator demanding the paperwork. It was an email from a prestigious life insurance conglomerate requesting an urgent private meeting to discuss the unexpected maturation of my hidden $5 million policy. The ultimate bait had just been dropped right into their eager, waiting hands. Richard held the fabricated municipal death certificate in his right hand, feeling the raised seal against his thumb. He had incinerated his entire retirement pension to procure that single sheet of forged parchment. The digital chime of his smartphone broke the silence of the suburban kitchen. He expected a mundane notification, or perhaps a desperate text from Brad begging for operating capital. Instead, the screen displayed an encrypted email marked with high importance from a premier global life insurance conglomerate. Richard opened the message, his eyes scanning the corporate letterhead. The text outlined a startling revelation regarding the estate of Angela Sterling. It stated that I possessed a hidden term life insurance policy valued at $5 million. The policy had triggered automatic maturation upon the registration of my medical proxy and the subsequent cessation of my health insurance premiums. The email requested an urgent private meeting to verify the next of kin and distribute the physical disbursement check. Desperation is a potent narcotic. It bypasses rational thought and amplifies cognitive dissonance. A prudent man might question why a multinational insurance firm would initiate contact before a public obituary even circulated. A cautious man might suspect a trap, but Richard was drowning in a self-created ocean of fraud. He saw a $5 million lifeline and swallowed the hook without a single moment of hesitation. He called Susan into the kitchen, showing her the illuminated screen. The color returned to her pale cheeks. The shame of her recent expulsion from the Oakmont Valley Country Club vanished entirely, replaced by a familiar, intoxicating greed. The email specified the location for the disbursement meeting. The insurance executive had reserved the private executive boardroom at that very same country club, citing a corporate partnership for high net worth estate settlements. This detail alone should have raised a terrifying red flag. Susan had been publicly exiled from those premises just days prior. Her membership was revoked due to a frozen member account. Yet the prospect of walking out of that building with a 7-figure check effectively erased her humiliation. She convinced herself that the country club management would grovel at her feet once they realized she was receiving a multi-million-dollar windfall. Richard dialed Brad, summoning his golden child back to the suburbs. My brother drove his least luxury vehicle down the peninsula, arriving at the house with a frantic, eager energy. Brad had spent his entire life waiting for unearned bailouts. Whenever his grades slipped in high school, my parents bribed the administration with new sports equipment. Whenever he crashed a car, they purchased a replacement and blamed the other driver. Now his commercial real estate venture was collapsing, and he expected his family to produce a miraculous rescue. Brad's phone vibrated incessantly in his pocket during the drive. The screen lit up with furious text messages from his betrayed seed investors demanding immediate capital audits. He swiped the notifications away, silencing the device. The impending $5 million windfall effectively anesthetized his anxiety. He convinced himself that settling the debts would instantly restore his reputation as a tech visionary. They gathered in the living room, formulating their final strategy. The plan was remarkably simple. They would attend the meeting, present the freshly forged municipal document, collect the $5 million, and wire the funds offshore to avoid further domestic banking scrutiny. They believed this single appointment would cure their financial paralysis and secure their fraudulent legacy forever. The following afternoon, the Jenkins family prepared for their triumphant return to high society. They adorned themselves in their finest garments, treating the occasion like a royal coronation. Richard wore a crisp charcoal suit, dusting off a vintage silk pocket square. Susan spent 2 hours applying immaculate makeup, concealing the dark circles of her recent despair under layers of expensive foundation. She chose a tailored ivory pantsuit, accessorizing with the diamond tennis bracelet she purchased using my hijacked routing numbers. Brad arrived wearing a bespoke navy blazer, his hair styled with meticulous precision, projecting the image of a successful Silicon Valley prodigy rather than a desperate tenant facing commercial eviction. They drove together to the Oakmont Valley Country Club in Richard's sedan, pulling up to the grand stone portico. The midday sun reflected off the pristine fountain near the entrance. Susan stepped out of the vehicle, raising her chin and adjusting her designer sunglasses. She intended to conquer the establishment that had humiliated her. They marched through the heavy glass doors, entering the expansive marble lobby. The familiar scent of fresh lilies and polished wood greeted them. Mr. Harrison, the meticulous general manager who had publicly expelled Susan, stood near the reception desk. When he spotted my mother, his posture stiffened. He took a deliberate step forward, prepared to summon his security personnel to enforce the ban. Susan did not shrink away. She offered a condescending smile, raising a manicured hand to halt his approach. "We are expected, Mr. Harrison," she declared, her voice echoing through the quiet foyer. "We have a private appointment in the executive boardroom with a corporate representative from the insurance conglomerate. Check your manifest before you embarrass yourself further." Mr. Harrison frowned, consulting the digital tablet held by the concierge. His expression shifted from rigid authority to strained confusion. The reservation was indeed verified. An anonymous corporate entity had secured the premium suite for the afternoon, paying the exorbitant rental fee in untraceable advance funds. The manager stepped aside, offering a curt nod. He gestured toward the sweeping mahogany staircase, refusing to offer any pleasantries. As they walked across the pristine threshold of the club, Susan felt a distinct thrill of vindication. The very same waiters who had watched her humiliating exit days prior now lowered their eyes, offering polite, deferential nods as she passed. She interpreted their professional submission as a formal apology. Her ego demanded constant validation, and the opulent surroundings provided the perfect backdrop for her psychological resurrection. The family ascended the steps, their confidence swelling with every riser. They interpreted the manager's silence as a profound admission of defeat. They truly believed their wealth had insulated them from the consequences of their actions. They walked down the plush, carpeted hallway, approaching the heavy oak doors of the VIP suite. The brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Executive Boardroom." Richard turned the polished brass handle, pushing the doors open. The room was a sanctuary of elite corporate privilege. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the manicured 18th green. A sprawling, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by plush leather ergonomic chairs. A silver ice bucket rested on a side console, chilling a bottle of vintage champagne next to 3 crystal flutes. The insurance executive had not yet arrived. The empty room felt like a stage waiting for the final act. Richard took the position of power, sitting at the head of the long table. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, placing the padded envelope containing the forged death certificate on the polished wood. He reflected on the 30 years he spent fetching coffee for ungrateful executives, dreaming of the day he could occupy the head seat. The forged document resting inside the manila envelope was his golden ticket out of suburban obscurity. He felt no remorse for the daughter he left broken in a hospital bed. He felt only a profound, sweeping entitlement to the wealth she had accumulated. Susan sat to his right, crossing her legs and admiring the sparkle of her stolen diamonds in the natural light. Brad paced the length of the room, looking out the expansive windows, his hands tucked into his pockets. "This is how it should be," Brad remarked, his tone dripping with unearned arrogance. "They tried to freeze us out, but we always win in the end. Once we secure this capital, I am buying the entire commercial building in San Francisco. I will be my own landlord." Susan reached for the champagne bottle, uncorking it with a soft, festive hiss. She poured the golden liquid into the 3 crystal flutes, handing them to her husband and her son. She raised her glass, offering a triumphant toast. To Angela, she purred a venomous smile, curving her lips. Her final contribution to this family is truly her greatest achievement. They clinked their glasses, sipping the premium vintage. The champagne tasted like victory. They settled into the luxurious leather chairs, soaking in the silence of the private suite. They checked their luxury watches, watching the minute hand inch closer to the designated appointment time. They stared eagerly at the heavy oak doors, waiting for the corporate representative to walk through, bearing the ultimate prize. They possessed no inkling of the digital net I had woven around this precise location. They did not notice the microscopic lens embedded in the smoke detector above their heads, feeding a live, encrypted video stream directly to a secure federal server. They did not know that the champagne they were drinking was purchased using the exact corporate credit card assigned to my venture capital firm. Every detail of this meeting was a carefully engineered illusion designed to extract their final, unforgivable confession. They sat in a room I owned, drinking wine I bought, waiting for a payout that did not exist. The trap was fully primed, holding them suspended in a fragile bubble of blinding greed. They waited for their salvation, unaware that the approaching footsteps echoing down the carpeted hallway belonged to the architect of their total annihilation. The rhythmic echo of my own footsteps resonated down the plush carpeted corridor of the Oakmont Valley Country Club. I bypassed the main dining areas utilizing a private service entrance secured by the property management team I now secretly employed. The journey to the executive boardroom felt less like a simple walk and more like a coronation march. Every step I took tested the titanium framework anchoring my right leg. The surgical reconstruction performed flawlessly, yielding a smooth, unyielding stride. I did not rely on a cane. I did not favor my injured side. The physical trauma inflicted by the car crash had healed, leaving behind a refined, calculated strength. I paused outside the heavy oak entrance, taking a slow, deliberate breath of the air-conditioned atmosphere. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored crimson blazer. The vibrant red fabric was a deliberate choice. It projected authority, danger, and an unapologetic demand for attention. It was the exact opposite of the muted, modest sweaters I wore during my former life as their invisible workhorse. My hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek chignon, emphasizing the sharp angles of my jaw. I checked the gold watch on my wrist, verifying the time. They had been sitting inside for 20 minutes, marinating in their own intoxicating greed. I reached forward, wrapping my fingers around the polished brass handle. I turned the metal mechanism, pushing the heavy wooden barrier inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. The scene inside the suite resembled a classical painting of aristocratic gluttony. Richard sat at the head of the sprawling mahogany table, exuding an aura of unearned triumph. Susan occupied the adjacent leather chair, crossing her legs to display her stolen diamonds in the natural sunlight pouring through the panoramic windows. Brad paced near the ice bucket, holding a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. They were relaxed, confident, and entirely unprepared for the reality stepping across their threshold. I advanced into the space, letting the heavy door rest ajar behind me. I stood tall, surveying the occupants with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing specimens under a microscope. The sudden silence descending upon the room rivaled the chilling vacuum of deep space. It was a rapid, suffocating quiet that instantly stripped the oxygen from their lungs. The ambient noise of the golf course outside seemed to fade into nothingness. Brad was the first to process the visual information. My brother had spent his entire youth shielded from consequence by our enabling parents. Whenever he failed the university exam or crashed a leased vehicle, Richard and Susan simply wrote a check to erase the problem. He navigated adulthood, believing his superficial charm could conquer any obstacle. He never encountered a barrier he could not manipulate until this exact second. His eyes widened, protruding from his face, as his brain short-circuited. He stared at me, unable to comprehend the living, breathing entity occupying the doorway. The muscles in his fingers simply gave out. The crystal flute slipped from his grasp, plummeting toward the hardwood floor. The shattering noise acted like a gunshot in the pristine environment, sending jagged shards and golden liquids scattering across the polished planks. Brad stumbled backward, his bespoke navy blazer brushing against the window pane. His tech startup, his penthouse office, and his arrogant illusions evaporated instantly. He looked at his sister, realizing no financial bailout could rescue him from a ghost returning to reclaim her stolen life. Susan reacted a fraction of a second later. A strangled, breathless gasp escaped her throat, sounding like a drowning swimmer fighting for surface air. Her manicured hands flew upward, clutching her neck as if she were choking on her own venom. The smug, triumphant flush she wore since walking past the country club manager vanished without a trace. Her complexion shifted from a vibrant peach to a sickly, ghostly gray. Growing up, my mother constantly belittled my wardrobe choices, favoring flashy designer labels to mask her own deep-seated insecurities. She equated material wealth with human value, often plunging our household into severe debt to maintain a facade of neighborhood superiority. Today, my crimson armor eclipsed her stolen ivory pantsuit. She looked at me and witnessed the undeniable manifestation of her own ruin. She sat, trapped in a chair, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet purchased using my hijacked routing numbers, staring at the daughter she condemned to a neglected state ward. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic, her chest heaving as the walls of her fabricated high society life collapsed inward. Richard suffered the most visceral physical collapse. My father built his entire identity on a foundation of hollow authority. He demanded respect from his family while displaying breathtaking cowardice in the corporate world. When he registered my face, his features twisted into a mask of raw, unadulterated terror. The false bravado he carried into the escrow office crumbled into dust, scattering into the chilling room. He tried to stand, attempting to project dominance, but his body refused to obey his commands. He stumbled backward, his custom Italian loafers slipping on the sleek floor. His knees buckled beneath him, yielding to the sudden, crushing gravity of his crimes. He hit the ground, scrambling backward on his hands and knees like a cornered, terrified animal. He retreated until his spine collided with the textured wallpaper, remaining pinned against the perimeter, paralyzed by the impossibility of my resurrection. Resting on the mahogany table, just inches from where Richard had been sitting, was the padded manila envelope containing the forged municipal death certificate. I tracked his gaze as he stared at the document. The piece of paper transformed instantly from a golden ticket to untold riches into a damning federal confession. He realized he had incinerated his legitimate retirement pension to procure a fraudulent document proving the death of a woman standing mere feet away from him. I did not shout. I did not shed a single tear of vindication or hurl insults at their cowering forms. Such emotional displays were tools for the weak, and I had purged all weakness during my grueling rehabilitation. I simply glided forward, projecting an aura of unyielding, clinical authority. The air pressure in the suite shifted, accommodating my presence while simultaneously suffocating theirs. I bypassed the sprawling table, ignoring my father trembling along the baseboards. I reached the entrance, pulling the heavy oak barrier shut. I placed my hand on the brass deadbolt, feeling the cool metal against my palm. With a swift, decisive twist, I engaged the locking mechanism. The sharp mechanical click reverberated through the silent space, echoing like the closing bars of a prison cell. I turned to face my family, offering a calm, calculated smile. It was not a gesture of warmth or reconciliation. It was the expression of an apex predator that had finally secured its prey within an inescapable enclosure. The trap was sealed tight, the stage was perfectly set. Their stolen paradise was about to become an infernal reckoning, and the broadcast of their ultimate betrayal was ready to commence. "Hello, Mother. Hello, Father." My greeting floated across the polished mahogany table, smooth and devoid of any familial warmth. The words hung in the chilled air of the executive suite, settling over their trembling shoulders like a heavy winter frost. Richard opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically to form a coherent syllable. He resembled a landed fish suffocating on dry land. For his entire corporate career, my father survived by shifting blame. Whenever an inventory shipment went missing or a quarterly projection missed its target, he effortlessly threw junior analysts under the bus, offering practiced excuses to his superiors. He inherently believed he could talk his way out of any consequence. I watched his brain scramble, searching for the familiar escape hatch, attempting to construct a narrative where my miraculous recovery was a joyous surprise rather than a legal catastrophe. "Angela," he choked out, his voice a thin, reedy whisper, "you are alive. We thought the doctors said—" I did not permit him to finish weaving his pathetic tapestry of lies. I raised my left hand, holding a sleek black remote control. I pressed the primary button, pointing the device toward the expansive presentation panel mounted on the far wall. The dark glass flared to life, emitting a crisp blue glow that illuminated their terrified faces. "You thought I was a silent, profitable casualty," I countered, my tone dropping to a clinical freezing register. "You assumed I would quietly expire in a forgotten state ward, allowing you to bypass probate and inherit a fortune you never earned. But your assumptions were always your greatest vulnerability." The digital display flickered before stabilizing onto a pristine, high-resolution video feed. The setting on the screen was undeniable. It was the living room of my Silicon Valley estate. The hidden infrared cameras I had installed years ago delivered broadcast-quality clarity. Susan let out a strangled whimper, pressing her knuckles against her mouth. The monitor showed her sitting on my Italian leather sofa, wearing the cashmere wrap she had stolen from my closet. Beside her, Richard held a crystal glass, swirling my imported Pinot Noir. The audio kicked in, channeling through the integrated surround sound speakers of the boardroom. Their own voices echoed back at them, capturing the exact moment they conspired to liquidate my existence. $2.5 million, the digital version of my mother whispered from the screen, her tone dripping with unbridled greed. "The buyer is wiring the funds today." The real Susan shrank into her luxurious leather chair, her eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors. She had spent decades curating a flawless suburban facade, attending charity luncheons and judging the moral failings of her neighbors. She thrived on projecting an image of pristine maternal devotion. Now she was forced to watch herself reveling in the simulated death of her own offspring. The pristine optical illusion she maintained for 30 years shattered into jagged, irreparable pieces. The video progressed, displaying the arrival of the crooked notary. We watched together as Richard leaned over the coffee table, gripping a pen. The camera zoomed slightly, capturing the precise, fluid motion of my father, forging my signature onto the property deed. "That is a felony, Richard," I remarked casually, pacing slowly along the edge of the conference table. "Forgery of a legal real estate document intended to deceive a federal escrow agency? It carries a mandatory minimum sentence." Richard squeezed his eyes shut, unable to witness his own blatant criminality. He dragged his palms across his sweating forehead, leaving damp streaks across his wrinkled skin. I clicked the remote a second time. The video transitioned, cutting away from the living room and shifting to the sterile confines of the intensive care unit. The hidden microphone on my encrypted smartphone had captured the encounter perfectly. The audio played. Susan leaning over my hospital bed, her voice distinct and venomous. "Goodbye, dead weight." Brad, who had remained frozen near the window, flinched as if struck by a physical blow. My brother possessed a boundless capacity for self-deception. He preferred to believe his seed money manifested through his own magnetic charm and brilliant networking skills. He never questioned the sudden influx of capital because validating his own genius was his primary coping mechanism. Hearing his mother discard his sister like a piece of spoiled meat finally pierced his thick armor of ignorance. He looked at Susan, a profound, sickening realization dawning in his eyes. He finally understood that his commercial launch party, his bespoke tuxedo, and his entire downtown headquarters were financed by blood money. "I am not finished," I stated, pressing the directional pad on the remote. The multimedia presentation shifted from video playback to high-contrast document scans. A stark white page filled the monitor, displaying the sworn affidavit of decedent status and sole heirship. The golden seal of the Federal Banking Commission gleamed in the upper corner. At the bottom, resting on the designated signature line, was Richard's distinctive, jagged handwriting. "You grew impatient, Father," I narrated, pausing near the ice bucket to observe his trembling hands. "When the escrow firm flagged the transaction, you panicked. Instead of retreating, you marched into their office and signed a sworn declaration under penalty of perjury. You legally attested to the United States government that I was deceased." Richard let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his spine sliding further down the textured wallpaper. He looked like a deflated balloon stripped of all his unearned arrogance. "But your crowning achievement required an even darker plunge," I continued, tapping the screen progression once more. The monitor refreshed, revealing the fabricated municipal death certificate. The intricate watermarks and counterfeit state seals were magnified for optimal viewing. $50,000, I recited, dictating the exact figure he wired to the anonymous broker. "You liquidated your entire legitimate corporate retirement pension, transferring the funds through an untraceable cryptocurrency tumbler to purchase a fake document on the dark web. You burned 3 decades of honest labor to finance a cybercrime." The boardroom descended into a stifling, agonizing silence. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock synchronized with the erratic, frantic pulsing of their terrified hearts. They were drowning in a sea of their own indiscretions, surrounded by undeniable empirical evidence. Brad stumbled forward, his knees weak, his hands outstretched in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Angela, please," he stammered, his voice cracking under the sheer weight of his impending doom. "I did not know. They told me you left the money to the family. They told me the tech startup was your dying wish. I just wanted to make you proud." I turned my gaze toward my brother, analyzing his pathetic attempt to salvage his freedom. "You never cared about making anyone proud, Brad. You only cared about securing your penthouse office and playing the role of a visionary. You signed a 10-year commercial lease featuring an ironclad personal guarantee. You tethered your entire financial future to that building." Brad nodded eagerly, hoping this was a negotiation. "I can break the lease," he offered frantically. "I can return the funds. We can undo this." "You cannot undo a signed contract with your landlord," I replied, a cold, predatory smile curving my lips. "And you certainly cannot break a lease when the property-holding firm is a subsidiary of my venture capital portfolio. Apex Holdings belongs to me, Brad. You signed a binding agreement to pay me millions of dollars using the exact cash you stole from my hospital bed." The remaining color drained from Brad's face, leaving him a pale, hollow shell. The realization struck him like a freight train. His perceived genius, his swift real estate acquisition, his lavish launch party, it was all a meticulously engineered cage. I leaned forward, resting both hands on the polished mahogany surface, closing the physical distance between myself and my betrayers. "You assumed I was a passive, compliant target," I whispered, my voice echoing through the silent suite. "You sold my sanctuary to a shell company I own. You signed a commercial lease with a holding firm I control. You utilized a debit card I systematically blocked. Every single failure you experienced this month, the declined transactions, the revoked country club membership, the frozen bank accounts, none of it was bad luck. None of it was a bureaucratic glitch." I stood tall, my silhouette casting a long, sharp shadow across the expensive boardroom table. "It was me," I declared. "I orchestrated every delay, every humiliation, and every single obstacle. I built this labyrinth, and I watched you eagerly run into every single dead end." Susan began to weep, genuine tears of profound terror streaming down her ruined makeup. She reached out a trembling hand, grasping the edge of the leather chair, seeking an anchor in a reality that had just fractured beyond repair. Richard remained pinned against the wall, his eyes wide and vacant, his mind shattered by the overwhelming magnitude of his legal peril. They possessed no escape route. The stolen millions were gone. Their reputations were incinerated. The evidence was insurmountable. They had walked into this premium suite, expecting an insurance executive bearing a multi-million-dollar check. Instead, they found the architect of their total destruction holding the ledger of their sins. The trap was fully illuminated, leaving no shadow for them to hide within. Yet the final decisive stroke of justice had not yet crossed the threshold. The true reckoning was waiting patiently, just on the other side of the heavy oak doors. Brad hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, dull thud. His bespoke navy blazer bunched around his hunched shoulders as he collapsed, dropping to his knees. The arrogant tech visionary persona he had cultivated for years vanished into the chilled air of the executive suite. He pressed his palms against the polished planks, bowing his head in a desperate, pathetic display of submission. Tears spilled over his cheeks, mixing with the cold sweat beading on his forehead. "Angela, please," he begged, his voice a ragged, broken whisper. "I will give the office back. I will sign over the startup. I will work for you to pay off the debt. You are my sister. You have to give me a second chance." My brother had navigated 34 years on this planet without ever facing a genuine consequence. Whenever he failed the university course or wrecked a leased vehicle, Richard and Susan simply opened their wallets to erase the damage. He believed every mistake carried a negotiable penalty. He thought he could barter his way out of federal embezzlement with hollow promises. I looked down at his trembling form, feeling zero pity. The time for familial mercy expired while I lay trapped in a medically induced coma, fighting to draw breath through a plastic tube. "You do not want a second chance, Brad," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "You want an escape hatch. When you thought I was dead, you did not hesitate to spend my savings on custom ice sculptures and premium catering. You are only apologizing because the cage door just locked behind you." He opened his mouth to offer another frantic excuse, but a sharp noise from the corridor silenced him. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom did not merely swing open. They were pushed wide by a distinct, undeniable force. Detective Liam Gallagher stepped across the threshold. The seasoned investigator traded his usual rumpled trench coat for a sharp, dark suit. He was not alone. 4 federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers flanked him, fanning out across the room to secure the exits. The gold shields clipped to their belts caught the sunlight streaming through the panoramic windows. The atmosphere inside the suite shifted instantly, from a corporate reckoning to an active federal crime scene. Richard pressed his spine harder against the textured wallpaper. His eyes darted toward the windows, measuring the distance to the golf course outside, before realizing he possessed no avenue of retreat. The false bravado he carried into the escrow office earlier that week dissolved into dust. Richard Sterling and Susan Sterling Gallagher announced, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded the space. "You are under arrest." The detective unsealed a thick manila folder, extracting the official warrants authorized by a federal judge just 2 hours prior. He read the charges with meticulous precision: interstate wire fraud, felony forgery, perjury against the United States government, conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Each legal term struck my parents like a physical blow, driving the reality of their doom deeper into their bones. 2 agents moved forward. They bypassed the mahogany table, approaching my father. Richard did not resist. He offered his wrists, turning into a hollow shell of a man. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs echoing in the pristine room signaled the definitive end of his suburban illusion. He lowered his chin to his chest, defeated by the crushing weight of his own profound hubris. Susan, however, refused to surrender her fabricated dignity. As a female tactical agent reached for her arms, my mother thrashed backward. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the sunlight as she struggled. She had spent decades curating a flawless high society image, judging her neighbors and parading her fake wealth. The denial ran too deep in her veins to accept a perp walk. "Get your hands off me," Susan shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You cannot do this. We are respected members of this community." The agent ignored her protests, securing the steel cuffs tightly around her wrists. Susan twisted her body, turning her face toward me, her expression contorted into a mask of pure venom. Stripped of her stolen millions, she attempted to wield her only remaining weapon. She tried to leverage her perceived social status. "You think you won, Angela?" she spat, her breathing erratic and shallow. "You think sending us away makes you powerful? I know the board of directors here. I know the senators' wives. I will call every single elite family in this county. I will have you blacklisted from Oakmont Valley. They will shun you for turning on your own blood. You will never show your face in high society." I allowed her to scream. I waited patiently for her vocal cords to tire and her chest to heave with exhaustion. I smoothed the lapels of my crimson blazer and walked toward the expansive glass overlooking the 18th green. "You always misunderstood the mechanics of wealth, Mother," I stated, keeping my back to her as I surveyed the manicured lawns. "You believed prestige came from buying expensive gowns and attending charity brunches. You thought rubbing elbows with politicians made you untouchable." I turned around, fixing her with a cold, unyielding stare. "High society is a business," I continued, my voice echoing clearly. "And this particular country club was drowning in quiet, hidden debt. It is a common secret among these prestigious institutions. They maintain pristine golf courses while struggling to cover basic operational costs. When your exorbitant brunch check bounced yesterday, it flagged your account. But it also triggered an automated review of the club's distressed assets by my venture capital firm." Susan blinked, her mouth falling open, as the pieces began to align in her mind. "Apex Holdings specializes in distressed asset acquisition," I explained, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I did not just freeze your bank accounts yesterday morning. I purchased the Oakmont Valley Country Club out of receivership. I paid their outstanding municipal tax liens and assumed full control of the board." The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll shattered on a concrete floor. "You cannot ban me from a property I own, Susan," I whispered, standing mere inches from her trembling form. "I am your landlord. I am your primary creditor. I hold the deed to the very ground you are standing on right now." The realization struck her like a freight train. Her knees buckled beneath her. The federal agents had to hook their arms under her armpits to support her dead weight. The elite sanctuary she worshipped, the very place she planned to humiliate me, had been my kingdom all along. Gallagher offered a grim nod, signaling the tactical team. "Move them out," he ordered. The agents marched Richard and Susan out of the executive suite. They guided them down the grand mahogany staircase and directly through the main lobby. The timing was impeccable. The elite members who had attended her fake memorial gala were currently sipping iced tea on the outdoor terrace. Those wealthy socialites pressed their faces against the glass, watching in stunned silence as the disgraced Sterling family performed a humiliating perp walk in federal chains. Brad remained kneeling on the floor, untouched by the tactical team, but destroyed nonetheless. Gallagher paused at the doorway, looking down at my brother. "The state prosecutors are handling the commercial fraud regarding your startup, Jenkins," the detective noted, his tone dripping with disdain. "Your eviction notices are already filed with the city clerk. I suggest you find a good bankruptcy lawyer." Brad crawled toward the exit, a broken man, heading toward a decade of crushing civil litigation and inescapable poverty. He stumbled into the corridor, leaving the suite behind. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. The room emptied, leaving me alone in the vast, quiet space. The silence returned, sweet and unburdened by the parasitic demands of my family. I walked over to the side console where the silver ice bucket rested. The bottle of vintage champagne remained perfectly chilled. I retrieved a crystal flute, pouring the golden liquid. The fine bubbles rose to the surface, catching the afternoon light. I raised the glass to my lips, taking a slow, satisfying sip. The taste of victory was crisp and undeniable. I turned back toward the panoramic windows, looking out over my sprawling green empire, breathing in the fresh, intoxicating air of total freedom. The past was finally erased, and the future belonged entirely to me. The harrowing journey of Angela Sterling serves as a brutal yet profoundly satisfying masterclass in the absolute folly of underestimating the quiet resilience of those you deem disposable, vividly demonstrating that when parasitic arrogance and unchecked greed blind individuals to the true nature of power, they will eagerly forge their own inescapable chains, plunging headfirst into a meticulously engineered labyrinth of federal indictments and total financial ruin, while chasing the hollow illusion of unearned high society prestige, ultimately proving that genuine strength does not require a loud, theatrical display or the validation of a country club membership to command a room, but rather operates with a cold, surgical precision in the shadows to reclaim stolen dignity and transform a heartbreaking familial betrayal into a masterful symphony of poetic justice, where the very assets stolen to fund a vaporware startup and purchase counterfeit municipal death certificates on the dark web become the exact instruments of their devastating public execution, leaving the perpetrators stripped of their fraudulent wealth, their fabricated social standing, and their freedom, as they are paraded out of the very institutions they sought to conquer in federal handcuffs, while the victim they left for dead in a sterile intensive care unit rises from the ashes of their treachery to sit unchallenged at the pinnacle of a vast, unyielding corporate empire. A stark reminder that loyalty cannot be bought, and karma, especially when backed by a team of ruthless corporate attorneys and a seasoned financial crimes detective, is an unstoppable force that will always collect its debts with uncompromising severity. So if this epic tale of righteous retribution, shattered illusions, and the ultimate triumph of authentic dignity over superficial performative luxury has resonated with your sense of justice, deeply captivated your imagination, and left you craving even more incredible narratives where the underestimated underdog reclaims their throne against all conceivable odds, please take a brief moment right now to leave a comment, thoroughly share this video with your closest friends, make sure to like, subscribe, and faithfully tune in for our next thrillingly dramatic adventure exclusively on Sophia Told Stories.